How's that?
Good.
Great. Well, it is great to be here. I feel honored to have been invited to participate in the Writers and Ideas program. So thank you, Dan, for inviting me, and thank you all for reading my book. I'm really grateful for that. Let's see. I titled this talk, Fireweed Burning on the Hills, and I'll let you know why I chose that title a little later. But before we talk about the how to write about loss and grief, I thought maybe it'd be useful to talk about why. Emily Dickinson wrote a longish poem for her. I'm just going to read 4 lines of it. It begins, I measure every grief I meet with narrow, probing eyes. I wonder if it weighs like mine or has an easier size. I've included the whole poem in your handout there. I'm going to try and address the question of why write about grief and loss by giving you a little bit of background on me, some of which is you can get from the book and some that you may not know. I grew up in Alaska, rural Alaska, with there were 5 of us and my parents. We lived in a tiny little house on Douglas Island, which is part of Juneau, and it was a 1-bedroom house. And when we moved in, there was an outhouse, and there were bare light bulbs hanging, and it was pretty much like somebody's summer cabin, but we moved in there on a permanent basis. And my father expected all of us to just jump in and fix it up with him. And I was 9 when we moved in, and my youngest sister was 6, and my brother must have been 14 or so. But he had great confidence that we could work with him and fix up the house and do anything that needed doing. And that confidence was based on his assumption that work was valuable and logic was valuable, and we were all good workers and we were all very logical. And I still work today as an engineering technician for county government, and I have to be logical 40 hours a week. And poetry helps me access that other part of my brain, and I'm really grateful for it. So with that faith he had in us for working and being logical, we built everything. First thing we did was add a wraparound deck to this tiny little house so we'd have a place to go outside. And I was 10 when I think I won a bid to paint the deck, and I got $1 an hour, and I did it all by myself. My brother and sister retarred the roof, and I didn't bid on that one. Later, my father decided we needed a boathouse. And we had a 1-bedroom house, and there were 7 of us in it, and my parents had been sleeping on a hide-a-bed for some years, but he decided what we needed was a boathouse because we had 2 boats, and they weren't covered. So the first thing we had to do was dig a foundation, and a neighbor came. Our house was on this little patch of rocky shoreline with a steep bank above it, and then the road was up above. The main part of the island was up above. The cement truck didn't have a hose long enough to pump the cement down to the beach, so we ended up building a flume out of corrugated tin roofing, and we're still just little. And we got all this tin roofing material, and we built this little scaffolding, we built this little flume, and the cement truck dumped the cement, and we took shovels and we coaxed it down to the beach, and we performed the stem wall and the concrete slab. And after that, we framed it, and we walled it in, and we insulated it. And I was 12, I think, when we finished it. My father decided to add on a sleeping loft on top, which I think saved his marriage. But I was 12 and I straddled that beam. It was 32 feet above the concrete floor, and I was the one that nailed the joist hangers along the beam. So all of this great confidence in our competence to do practical things was there, but there wasn't anything else. It was all surface related, it was all logic, and there wasn't any value placed on emotion. In fact, really there was no allowance for emotion. And so on the surface, we were very competent, and it seemed ideal to be that competent. But when grief struck our household, we had no tools to deal with it, none of us. We buried our noses in books. I think I read every Agatha Christie and Zane Grey book that existed in about the year 1972, and so did the rest of the members of my family. And we all began drinking and smoking and partying. We're all still young teenagers. And my parents just turned a blind eye to that because they were trying to deal with their own issues, and they had no clue how to go about it, dealing with grief any more than the children did. So why write about it? Well, one reason is the validation that you get when you share your story and you find out you're not alone. There's a lot of people that have been through a lot of things that are similar to what you've been through, and your feelings are not really all that strange. They're wild and uncomfortable, and you don't like to talk about them, but they're really not that strange. Emily Dickinson goes on to nail that feeling pretty well in that poem that's in your handout. So my writing on grief began there with this need for validation, but it didn't stop there, and I'm really grateful for that. And your writing on grief and loss doesn't need to stop there either. Before I sent the manuscript of 100 Steps to Shore off to Blue Begonia Press, about at least 10 other publishers hoping someone might take a look at it, I had a copy of it with me at another Port Townsend Writers Conference that I went to a couple of years ago. One afternoon, we had a writing assignment to sit outside under this huge madrona tree that sits overlooking the bluff at Fort Worden, where the conference is held. And under the instruction of a teacher from, I think she teaches in Colorado somewhere, she had us do this assignment where we wrote to a shrine. We were supposed to write to the color red, and we were supposed to gather things that were red, and we built a little shrine of red under the tree, and we sat around and we wrote. Well, one of the things that happened there is the last poem in the book came from that afternoon of writing, Red Shrine. But a bigger thing happened, and that is that a woman that was sitting under the tree with me, and I exchanged some of our work. And I selected at random a little sample from the manuscript. And the next day, she came up to me, and what we had been going to do was give each other feedback on the writing and give the writing back to each other with our notes in the margins, etc. But she asked to keep her copy because she wanted to show it to her mother. And it turned out that she, too, had had a sister who died in an accident. And her mother had never gotten over it, and she had never gotten over it. And one of the things that happened when they would get together is invariably her mother would bring up the fact that nobody had called to say they were sorry. She just couldn't get over it. She goes, why didn't he say he's sorry? Why doesn't he just say he's sorry? So I knew, I don't know why I picked that particular poem to give her as part of the sample, but it was an excerpt from Northern Lights, Stop Shining, and a part that goes something like, 10 years after my sister's death, my husband ran over a 2-year-old boy. I asked how the boy was now, how he was. He did not know the answer to either. Said the policeman recommended he not call the hospital, not apologize, because that would be admitting guilt. So we can't know how our words might touch another person, but we can know that they will touch another person in some manner, and that alone is reason enough to write about loss and grief. It's hard to make public a personal loss. It takes a lot of strength to expose vulnerability to a perfect stranger, and I think it takes even more courage to expose your vulnerability to your family and friends. But the strongest writing can come from the most intense emotions, I believe. And suppressed emotions can gather mass and density, and they turn into kind of a black hole and suck you in and you disappear. And climbing out of that hole is difficult. It takes a lot of work. But to pull another human being out of that hole is remarkable. And that's a good reason to write. So the importance of sharing poems on the topic becomes evident when you find one that touches you. When I find a poem that moves me deeply, that I can relate to, I feel more whole. I feel more connected to the world, and I feel somehow a little bit healed, even if it's a different kind of loss, and even if I don't have the words for it it creates the emotion. It makes me feel better. There's a poet, Gregory Orr. He wrote a book called Poetry as Survival, a lot of other books. He, too, experienced an accident in his childhood. He recorded an essay for the NPR series, This I Believe. Have any of you ever listened to that, This I Believe? And I listened to that recently. And in it, Gregory Orr says, I'm going to read quote a little bit of the essay. Whenever I read a poem that moves me, I know I'm not alone in the world. He goes on to say that their poem gives me hope and courage because I know they survived. Their life force was strong enough to turn experience into words and shape it into meaning, and then bring it toward me to share. The gift of their poem enters deeply into me and helps me live and believe in living. And I feel like he expressed my thoughts on the matter exactly. He went on to say, because poems are meanings, even the saddest poem I write is proof that I want to survive. And therefore, it represents an affirmation of life in all its complexities and contradictions. And then he says, an additional miracle comes to me as the maker of poems. Because poems can be shared between poet and audience, they also become a further triumph over human isolation. Last week, I drove up to Port Townsend to attend a poetry reading from the former poet laureate Ted Kooser and a good friend of his, Dan Gerber. They both have books out in Copper Canyon Press. They sat in the Wheeler Theater, which is where most of the lectures for the Port Townsend Writers Conference are held. They sat on stage together and swapped poems back and forth like the old friends that they are. It was a wonderful reading. But right in the middle of it, Dan Gerber, as part of an introduction to a poem about loss that he read, stated a belief that the function of any art is to nurture a desire to go on living. And that really struck me. I wrote it down. To nurture a desire to go on living. Poetry has that power, and your poems have that power. So let's talk about how to go about it. Marvin Bell, another fine poet, in a craft lecture that he gave at PLU's Rainier Writing Program, a friend that's in the program, and she'd send me lectures now and then, so I was really grateful, said, prose is prose because of what it includes, whereas poetry is poetry because of what it leaves out, or seems to leave out. The best poetry uses words to go beyond words. In that same lecture, he continued, and every poem is valid. He quoted William Stafford. Poetry, said Stafford, is a natural human activity. When asked when he began to write poetry, Stafford would respond, when did other people stop? Then Marvin Bell talked about William Carlos Williams. He wrote a bit about his motivation and said, I'm going to read a little bit from that essay, from Bell's essay. William Carlos Williams was a doctor in private practice. He was the country doctor, too, during a world war. He had a wife and sons. He ran in and out of New York City to try to be part of the scene there. And he wrote 39 books, poems, plays, memoirs, essays. He had an old wooden desk to which one could bolt a manual typewriter on the underside. He'd flip it over and write in between patients. And he'd write on prescription blanks in the car before going into a party. Poor Flossie, his wife, Marvin Bell says, had to wear a neck brace occasionally because one day Bill was racing to a party so he'd have time to write in the car before the party started. He ran over the railroad tracks too fast and Flossie's head hit the roof of the truck. So, and how and why, Bell says, did this busy doctor who made house calls and delivered thousands of babies do all that writing? Why is because he had to. How is a kind of miracle of stamina and imagination. All right, how? Miracle of stamina and imagination. So I'm going to talk about 3 ways to generate material for poems of grief and loss, and then we can look at ways of shaping the poem into a finished work. that will provoke a visceral response from the reader and leave a lasting impression. These are just methods that work for me. You'll find your own way, but these are 3 things that I do that have been effective in generating highly charged material with which to make a poem. The first comes from the premise that memory is essential to writing authentically about loss. Memory is essential to writing authentically about loss. I don't really know that that's true for everybody, but I feel that it's true for me. In your handout, there is, you don't have to find it right now, but there's an exercise you can do from Steve Cowett's book. He's a poet and a teacher. He wrote a book called In the Palm of Your Hand. And there's a lot of useful information in that book. I highly recommend it, about writing poetry in general, and on writing poetry generated from childhood memories. He offers just simple exercises on recovering a memory, accessing a memory, which I believe adds authenticity to your writing. I'm going to go through, I'll just kind of condense the exercise and run through what happened the first time I tried this exercise. And it's called A Process for Recovering Memories. You don't have to do this right now, but I'm just going to kind of read the instructions briefly. Open your notebook and write down this list of memory stimulators. Then jot a few words or phrases for each memory that comes to you as you go down the list. Essentially, you're making an abbreviated record of the incident that you recalled. Something as brief as, to quote Steve Cowett, "crazy man in green hat" will do to remind you of the incident. You're just trying to get something that'll jog your memory. Some of the memories will likely generate a strong emotion, and that's good because strong emotion indicates hot material for a poem. I'm going to read through about probably a little less than half of the items that are in the list, which are in your handout. It says, recall a building in which you once lived, a secret you once had, a magical person from your childhood, something dangerous you did when you were young, something that happened years ago near a body of water. That's 5 of them. I think there might be a dozen in his list. So I just took that first one, and this was an exercise that we were assigned in Joe Stroud's class that year, and I think it says 2003 on your bag, so I think it was 2003. A building in which you once lived is the one that I used. And it says, after jotting down a brief phrase for each suggestion that resulted in a memory, choose one. The title poem in my book came from this exercise. Item 1, a building in which I once lived, triggered the hospital memory, and I'm not sure why, unless it was just that it seemed like a lifetime that we were there and it was a day. So I followed the instructions, which were to close your eyes and replay the memory from beginning to end. And you need a quiet place to do this, but you're not writing anything down at this point. You're just closing your eyes and replaying an event, an incident, a memory from beginning to end without any censoring or analysis, just as though it's a film passing through your mind's eye. So do this without writing anything down, let the story replay itself, and then go back through the incident. And as you do, pause in the recalling of the incident and try to remember as many specific details as you can. And I just made up a memory and from there. I remember my uncle was really mad, but he kicked the guinea pig off the coffee table, his black cowboy boots shining blue in the reflection of the television screen. Not, I was scared, but I pressed as far back into the couch as I could. The cushion felt warm beneath me. I looked down and found I'd wet my pants. I covered myself with a gold knit afghan Aunt Leah had given my mother just that afternoon. So what clothing did you have on? What about the uncle? What did you hear, smell, feel? Was it rainy, hot, winter? Write it all down, everything, every little thing, no matter how trivial it seems, you're going to get rid of most of it later. So then you run through the incident a third time. And so you've written down this wild, scribbly memory, and there's a sample. The draft of 100 Steps from Shore is in your handout, and you can see the list I made of the building in which I once lived and some of the other memories that came. And then my first draft in writing which is the second time I played the incident through my head. I sat and followed the instructions, not writing, and then I wrote it all down, and then I ran through it a third time and tried to add anything else that came up. And it took me a few pages, as you can see. And when you think you're done, then ask yourself what impact this incident had on you. Why do you remember it? Maybe, probably, it was something that changed you in some way. A rite of passage, something that hurt deeply, or something that still affects you today in some way. So if none of this seems like a poem, or seems like it's not about anything, don't worry. Don't try to force your poem to be about something, just write. I seldom know. I think I could probably say I never know what my poem is about during the initial writing of it. It is in the rewriting that its purpose hopefully becomes clear. Marvin Bell said, he's got a list of statements about writing, and every time I find that list online, it's growing, so I don't know if we just keep adding to it or whatever. He says, it's not what one begins with that matters. It's the quality of attention paid to it thereafter. And he says, poetry has content, but is not strictly about its contents. A poem containing a tree may not be about a tree. And what they say there are no words for, that's what poetry is for. Poetry uses words to go beyond words. So for this discussion, we'll assume that the memories involve grief in some way. I found a definition of grief at an online counseling for loss site. I have the link, which I can give you if you're interested. And they define grief like this. A helpful equation which proves itself daily in all instances is change equals loss equals grief. Change equals loss equals grief. This means a change of circumstance of any kind, which is a change from one state to another, produces a loss of some kind, which is the stage changed from, which will produce a grief reaction. The intensity of the grief reaction is a function of how the loss is perceived. If the loss is not perceived as significant, the grief reaction will be minimal or barely felt or maybe not felt at all. I think they go on to have an example about losing a parking spot that you're aiming for and somebody else gets it first. As in, you go through all these little stages of grief, but then it's over in 10 seconds and you just find another spot. Well, hopefully. That's all that you do. So based on that definition, the generated memory that feels the most charged is likely to be the one that produced a significant loss. And I would bet that everyone in this room has experienced a significant loss of one form or another. So this material is the basis for your poem. We'll talk about shaping the material into a finished poem, but I'd like to look at the other means of generating the material first. So the second method that is effective for me sounds odd, but it's to write a letter. I do this quite a bit. I address a letter either to the object of my loss or to someone that I just want to tell about it. It works pretty well, but the presumption here is that you've already got the memory, you've access to the incident. It's in your mind. In fact, it might be in your face, one of those recurring dreams where you wake with the same strong emotion every time, or a recurring vision of a traumatic event, something like that. So the material is obviously highly charged, and you want to do something constructive with it, mainly make yourself feel better to begin with, which is a valid reason for writing. So I've written successfully to both the incident or the subject of the incident and to another person describing my loss, and more about that in a minute. But you might start. Back to the guinea pig. Dear Uncle Lester, I still remember the day you killed Snowball. I was watching Get Smart on TV and Max was talking into his shoe. Then your boot swept across the table and Snowball was sliding down the wall. She looked like the collar on Mom's white bathrobe. When they came home, you told them I took the guinea pig outside to play with her, which I never do. and that she ran beneath the neighbor's fence. They didn't believe me when I said what really happened. They made me draw a picture of Snowball and put up a missing sign on the streetlight at the end of the driveway. They don't believe me still. So you can see how that's charged material for a poem. And so you go ahead and you fill your letter with all the details you can. You can put it all in without censoring your thoughts. Nobody else has to see it, and you know you're going to be revising it later if it turns into a poem. It's critical to turn off the editor when you're writing anything, but I think it's especially so to turn off your internal editor when the subject matter is something that provokes a strong emotion in you as you're writing it. Sometimes the conscious self is ashamed of the subconscious feelings, and if they rise, you quell them because you've been taught that the thoughts are bad or that they're socially unacceptable. But in this letter, there's no censor. It's a confession of sorts, an unburdening, a way of just letting it all out without fear of judgment. And you know the person on the other end's going to understand. So a poem that I mentioned earlier, Northern Lights Stop Shining, began this way. It began with a letter that I wrote to Dan Peters. It's the bottom thing that you picked up in your handout that's not stapled to the other part. It recounts the incident as it came back to me after I read Dan's story of the accident in his book, The Reservoir. I used lines from Dan's work in the letter, not only because referring to his story gave me the courage to go on with my story, but because his story actually helped me remember mine. So you have that letter in it, which really is the very first draft of Northern Lights Stop Shining, and the finished poem is also included in your handout. So it might be interesting to read the letter and then read the finished poem. And I have had that method. This letter did not start out with any intention whatsoever of becoming a poem. It was completely just catharsis. And I knew that Dan would understand, and I had been needing to tell this story for almost 30 years. So I'm very grateful for that opportunity. But that brings me to the third method that works for me, and that is to steal. Steal a line from anybody and write from it. Read everything you can get your hands on and use it to stimulate your own writing. Author Michael Martone claims this: to write well, you not only have to expose yourself to good literature, but you have to graze in the aisles and be willingly distracted. Read. Be first a hero and then a thief. All reading is a kind of detection, and it all informs your writing. When I find a poem that touches me, or a line that makes my breath catch in my throat, I'll write it down at the top of the blank page in my notebook and write from it, just whatever it generates, with no preconceived notion of where I'm going, or if I'm even going to get a poem, or if I'm just writing. If I can't think of anything myself on any given day, and I try to write every day. I fail at that, but I do try to write every day. But if I can't find anything inside myself, that's exactly what I do. I pick up a book at random, and I look for a line that strikes me, and I write it at the top of the page, and then I just kind of address it. I'm just writing from that line, whatever comes. And if nothing comes, sometimes I'll just repeat the line. Just write the line at the top of the page a few times, and pretty soon you'll branch off and find yourself scribbling something. So I've also, besides poetry, I found lines in short stories, in nonfiction, in newspaper headlines. I recently read Sherman Alexie's short story, The Sin Eaters, and I stole this line to begin a poem, and I'm going to read it later tonight. 1,000 paper birds rattled and sang. Isn't that a great line? So I wrote that at the top of the page. I had no idea what might come of it. It just struck my fancy, and turned out it's turning into a poem. I think it's still in transition. I'll read it tonight anyway, but it's turning into a poem about my father's death. And it's triggered by a memory that somehow that line triggered a memory of my father singing with my mother when we were really young, and I don't know when. Joseph Stroud, who's the poet and friend of ours that Dan mentioned, in a lecture we attended at the Writers' Conference, said that we're allowed to write 90% crap. And then we have to write the 90% crap in order to arrive at the 10% that's our real work. So don't be afraid to write it all down. You could do what I've done, which is to make a pact with my partner. If one of us dies, he's also a writer, the survivor is committed to gathering all the notebooks and burning them without reading them. So if you have someone you trust, you can make that pact too. And that's very liberating in just being able to just write and don't worry about writing really bad stuff, because I'll usually write several pages of really bad stuff before I find any little things that I can circle and keep for later. So back to that letter for a minute. Dan took that letter and he posted it on the poetry pole in Jim Bodine's garden. And I was embarrassed. I was kind of glad it was there, but I was also embarrassed because I wasn't sure that I was ready for anybody else to hear this story. But what happened was I found that very freeing. All of a sudden, who knows who knew my story? Everybody might know it. I don't know how many people go stop and read the poetry poll, but it's possible that a lot of strangers all of a sudden knew my story. And I think that also helped me transform that letter into what I hope is an unsentimental revelation of a shaping event from my childhood, and one that readers can relate to. And just having that woman whose sister also died in an accident tell me that her mother was still hung up over the fact that she'd never received an apology for the person she considered responsible for the accident that took her daughter's life, that keeps me writing. It makes it all worth it. It makes all that exposing of all your vulnerabilities worth it. Okay, so that's 3 methods that I use to generate material for poems of grief and loss. And we'll spend a couple minutes on talking about finding and finishing the poem, and then if you have some questions, I think we'll have time for some. So, revisioning the poem as a means of achieving clarity and provoking a connection with the reader. Time for, as Marvin Bell said, the miracle of stamina and imagination. Okay, we have a poem, or we think we have a poem. We've got a dramatic narrative, we have a highly charged event, and we have lots of specific details. All elements of a good poem, so now what? So here's what I do. I read the draft aloud. I tell myself the story, and I change it as I go. If something occurs to me, I jot notes in the margins, I cross out stuff that doesn't matter, that just doesn't seem very interesting. Parts that scare me or that make me just wish I hadn't ever even remembered this, I circle those as being probably really important. So you strike every phrase in that rough material that doesn't push the poem forward. In our example, the action is what was interesting. Say the writer had in his first writing of that letter to Uncle Lester included the fact that Aunt Leah was his favorite aunt, and when he was little, she took him to the city and they went to a car museum, and he still likes old cars today. So that could easily end up in that first letter. But does it end up in the finished poem? No, because it's nothing that's highly charged, and even though it's interesting to the writer, it's not really interesting to the reader or nor essential to the action that's taking place. So you take what's left, you've stricken the dull phrases, and you've added little notes and details, and you've made notes in the margins, and now it's time to take what's left and rewrite it with new details and maybe more active language that you've discovered in your reading of the piece aloud. This is when I transfer it to the computer. I write everything longhand and then I transfer it to the computer. I know a lot of people just write directly onto their laptops, so whatever method works for you, you'll find it. But you'll notice that in all 3 of these methods, what I begin with is not poetry at all. It's prose. I write from margin to margin. I'm not thinking line breaks. I'm not thinking rhythm or music or form. None of that. I'm just getting the material raw onto the page. But at this point, I start thinking about all those things. I start thinking about lines. I start listening for the music of the line and sounds that sound similar, metaphors that aren't working, all sorts of poetic things that I wasn't thinking about at all when I was trying to get the raw material down. So listen for this and read the poem aloud again, and listen to the sounds of it, and you'll find the music and the rhythm of it as you go. And just keep tinkering with it for a time, and as long as you can sit still and then get up. One thing I wanted to point out is that poems of loss are vulnerable to being sentimental. I mean, any poem is vulnerable to that, but poems of loss, I would think, are particularly vulnerable to sentimentality. I think that sentimental poems overstate their case, drip with emotion, and often tell the reader how to feel. Not only that, but they can be so full of personal references that mean something to the writer but not to anybody else, that the emotion is actually inaccessible. The reader won't buy into the poem because they can't feel it. So it's important to avoid sentimentality. And you know what, your first draft will probably be full of it when you're just writing the memories and the stories. And that's fine, but it shouldn't be in your finished product. So if this was my letter to Uncle Lester, my guinea pig would not be named Snowball, for instance, even if that were the real guinea pig's name. Maybe it would not be a guinea pig at all. Maybe it would be my baby sister. And that's another thing. Never let the facts stand in the way of the truth. The emotional truth and the literal facts are not necessarily the same thing. In fact, they often are not the same thing. The emotional truth you need to be true to. The facts, you're not writing nonfiction, you're writing poetry. So when you're remembering and writing the incident as it happened, be true to the facts, say everything you remember in that first draft. But after that, be true to the poem. And don't worry about being a nonfiction writer unless you're wanting to be a nonfiction writer, and then you'll need another class. So how do you avoid sentimentality? I think all you really need to do is be able to recognize it, and you'll be able to avoid it. Look for, in your work, flowery language and the use of abstractions. An image that evokes an emotion is always more effective than a declaration of the emotion. An image that evokes an emotion is always more effective than a declaration of the emotion. And then beware of poetic language. If the diction is not believable, the poem will be ineffective even if the subject matter is really intense. Poets used to be expected to use formal language and poetic diction, but that's not true in contemporary poetry. Beware of references to things that are obvious to you but won't mean anything to anyone else. And by anyone else, I mean a stranger, not your family. And then beware of already overused images that stand for an emotion. Lack of fresh imagery equates to lack of emotional response in the reader. Example, Robert Burns' "My love is like a red, red rose." Well, when he wrote it, that was probably fresh, but it doesn't do anything for me today. Okay, so now you're going to go through the poem one more time, probably several more times, but go through the poem again and rework any part of it that does any of the above things. Get rid of the flowery language, any poetic diction, any references that aren't necessary to the poem and mean something only to you, or expand on those references so that they will mean something to the reader. And replace any abstractions with concrete imagery. In concrete imagery, you have to also consider whether it's fitting for the poem that you're writing. In Joe Stroud's lecture, that same lecture, I think, he talked about effective metaphor and read a list of what he called metaphors that miss, I think. And I only wrote down one of the examples. I wish I had the list, but it was this. It was an American tradition, like fathers chasing kids around with power tools. So maybe that actually is not so far off the mark. But try and make sure that the metaphor that you're using fits your subject matter. And aim for precision and restraint. You need to be ruthless with your language, which is not the same thing as being heartless with the poem itself, I don't think. But get rid of any trite phrases, any poetic language, any confusing references, and then search for the exact word that expresses what you're really trying to convey. A good exercise is to temporarily get rid of all the adjectives and adverbs in your poems. Just delete them all, print it out, and then walk away. And walk away for an hour or a month or however long you can stand it. But when you come back, read the poem aloud without any of its adjectives, as though it was someone else that wrote it. Just read it aloud as though you've never heard it before. It has no adjectives in it, and you know nothing about it. Then it's pretty easy to decide what needs to go back in. And usually you'll need a little bit to go back in, but not nearly as much as was in there before. Clarity is critical to all writing, but especially so when writing about loss. And the clarity is in the precise detail and the exact metaphors we were discussing. It's in the cutting of inessential words and choosing what to leave in the poem and what to take out of the poem. Sometimes a poem needs cutting and sometimes it needs expanding. In my work, almost always it needs to be trimmed rather than expanded. So, and at this point, I sometimes try and get the form. I'll try it out in different forms. I think I've got music and rhythm in my poem. I've got the sounds the way I like them. I've got the details that I like. But it's all still in a jumble, and I don't really know what I'm doing with it. I might try putting it into couplets or quatrains. I might try all one long, skinny stanza. I might try enjambment or end-stop lines. Try stanza breaks in the middle of phrases rather than end-stop stanzas. Kind of tends to make your poem keep flowing down and keeps the reader interested. And you'll just have to tinker with it and find the form that's most effective for the piece you're writing. I think you'll see in that book I have a lot of different forms, and none of them came from any instruction. They were all just kind of instinctive. Okay, are we there yet? We've looked at 3 ways to generate material for a poem: finding a means of recovering a memory, addressing a letter to the object of your loss, and stealing a line from another writer and writing down whatever that prompts in you. So we've gathered all the material, cut and edited, and looked for music, fresh images, and exact words. We've turned the raw material into a poem, and we've worked hard to get this far. Now what I do is I set the poem aside. I try not to hurry and submit it somewhere just because I want to get it published or share it with someone. Susan Ludvigsen said in a craft essay titled Writing and Ambition that each of us needs to give our writing time to ripen, consciously and unconsciously, revising as we make discoveries. And even more crucial, we need to learn how to be led to discovery by the language. So set this poem aside if you can, and then come back to it as often as needed as you make those discoveries. Okay, if we're successful in our endeavor, we've written a poem that narrates a personal loss and yet touches a reader in some lasting way. In doing so, we've written a poem that is both personal and universal. We have achieved what Gregory Orr said in that NPR essay: an additional miracle comes to me as the maker of poems. Because poems can be shared between poet and audience, they become a further triumph over human isolation. Okay, I'll talk for one more minute. You have a couple questions. Joe Stroud very generously wrote a statement on the back of my book in which he mentioned how elegy turned from grief to wonder to praise. And I titled this discussion Fireweed Burning on the Hills because in the Northwest, at least in Alaska and the far northern Washington coast, fireweed is the first thing that grows back after a forest fire or after a clear cut. And in my mind, that kind of made fireweed, I could liken fireweed to what grows after grief and loss. If grief and loss is forest fire and clear cut, then fireweed pushes through the ashes and blooms. And I know that's kind of a corny analogy and a little bit sentimental, but it's not a poem. So if we accept that, then memory is a root, and first drafts are the tendrils or the first leaves. The actual poem, the expression of loss, would be the stalk and the buds. And then the blossom opening, I think, can be the grief turning to wonder. And when the blossom is spent and falls back to the ground, I think that's the final transformation from grief to wonder to praise. Joe Stroud, in closing, I'd like to quote him. He said, "There's only 2 kinds of poems. Poems that make a difference in our lives and poems that do not." He said only we can determine what kind of poem each one is for us as the reader, and that when we find those poems that change our lives, do all you can to hold on to them, do everything you can to write them. Thank you.
I have no idea what time it is.
I have that 7:26. Do we have time for a couple questions?
We have time for maybe one question.
Sorry.
Let people in.
Peggy?
Well, actually, this isn't my question, but I promised her I'd ask it. A student who couldn't be here. Okay. Just a minute. Okay, go to someone else. Let me find it, but come back to me.
You may be it.
What?
I have a question, but mine's real involved, so I'm going to kind of stall.
You can ask me after the reading.
Okay.
God.
Is it the two S's?
Yeah. Okay, well, essentially it was to her, your poems dealt with two important subjects, sex and sadness. She wanted to know if that's because that's all there is, or what happens with, what about joy / happiness and
Accomplishment.
and sense of accomplishment.
Pride.
Huh?
Pride. Wow. And that's
Yeah.
a very, I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question. I think that my next collection that I'm working on has a lot more joy in it and a lot more about accomplishment and about moving on. I think this book for me was kind of a journey that Joe described on the back of the book. It moved from grief to wonder to praise, and it definitely is not my whole life, but it was a big part of it. This growing up, I think death is something that affects us very deeply, and it takes a lot of years to work through it if you're lucky enough to do it at all. And sex is the other big part of life. And there's a lot about growing up in the book. And I can't say that all of that is strictly factual, but it's all the emotional truth. And if you look in those poems, I think you will find that there is joy within those poems. Sadness and joy go hand in hand. And so I hope that I'd like to get a chance to meet that student and talk more about it. Thank you.
All right, let's welcome to YVCC's final reading for spring 2007 and last reading for the Blue Begonia Press poetry series here at Yakima Valley Community College. This is the third of 3 years of this class and this reading series, and we'll do something different next year, so I hope you are looking for it in the catalog and in the paper, etc. But before we have our Greg come up and introduce our poet tonight, I wanted to make a couple of quick announcements. One, the Student Literary Journal Prism has just come out this week, the result of a lot.
Good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing tonight? All right. Tonight we're lucky enough to have with us a gifted writer by the name of Jenifer Browne Lawrence. Jenifer was born in California in 1958 and was raised in Alaska. She currently lives in Paulsville, Washington, where she works as a stormwater management technician for the county government. Jenifer was the recipient of a 2006 Washington State Artist Trust Grant, the Potomac Review's annual poetry award, and she has been finalist for the James Hurst Poetry Prize. Her work has received a Pushcart nomination and has been published in various journals and anthologies, including the North American Review, the Comstock Review, and the Potomac Review. In 2006, Blue Begonia Press published her first poetry collection, 100 Steps from Shore. 100 Steps from Shore has been said to be elegiac and redemptive in nature. Jenifer's work is informed by the landscape and experiences of her Alaskan childhood. In these brave and powerful poems, Jenifer Browne Lawrence looks hard at her past, at loss and sorrow, at the great mystery at the heart of our world. As Natasha Money put it, within the ever-growing population of poetry, Jenifer Browne Lawrence is a voice to follow, for in the following, one will be amazed for all the brightness achieved amidst shadow. Please join me in welcoming this evening Jenifer Browne Lawrence.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming. I'm really enjoying myself. Thanks for that nice introduction, too. We just had a discussion about writing about grief and loss, and I ended the talk by saying that I consider this book, 100 Steps from Shore, to be sort of a journey that moves from grief to wonder to praise. And I'm going to try and do that in my reading tonight as well. As you may know, I was raised in Alaska after being born in California, as Greg says. The first poem I'm going to read is set there in California before the move. And it is, I guess if you've read the book, you know that I had a sister who died at the age of 14 in a car accident. She had survived a very similar accident 5 years before that when she was 9. The first section of the book deals a lot with her life and death. And this is Harbinger. When she was 5 and I was 4, my sister skipped between Manzanita and Redwood, kicked a nest of yellow jackets. Her playmates passed on either side of the trees, turned to hysteria in a stinging cloud. Her face was swarmed away. I saw through my tears the wasps had killed her. The boy and girl, holding onto her hands, hold a headless body from the wash of autumn woods. The title of this next poem was stolen from a line of Wallace Stevens' poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. I think you'll recognize the line. It says, "It was snowing and it was going to snow. Maybe we were making angels in the yard. A station wagon swerved, plowed you under. The neighbor's cat crossed the road. A white helicopter took you. It was the first Christmas since we moved from Santa Cruz to Valdez. The neighbor stayed, kissed us goodnight, her breath like Daddy's after supper. We took down the tree, no one to tell us which box each ornament came from. We walked around the ice to catch the school bus, to come home. The stain seeped all the way to asphalt, all the way to hibernating iris in the yard. Each snowfall brought the plow, its blade uncovering your blood. You relearned our names, the cupboard where we kept the toys. You were younger, different. We bought you a cat of your own, black as your new grown hair. In the discussion we just finished, I talked about what led up to this poem, Northern Lights Stop Shining. I thought I would read it tonight. Northern Lights Stop Shining. Because the dress I wanted was not in the closet, my mother spoke. They told me to find something for her to wear. I gave them the blue shoes, too. It is supposed to rain when someone dies, but it was hot at the cemetery. The McNabb boys were there, and the Caldwells. They lived on either side of us, about a half mile between each house. My brother, gone 2 weeks at the academy in New London when she died, did not come home. I don't remember why she was taking a walk. 7 of us lived in a 1-bedroom house. We spent a lot of time outside. I stole $1 once from her savings, a roll of bills held together with rubber bands in her drawer. She counted and counted, 23, 24, 25. I had $26. You took one. She sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing her hands fast on her thighs the way she did when she was upset and didn't know what else to do. 10 years after my sister's death, my husband ran over a 2-year-old boy. I was in Juneau visiting family when he called. I told her not to pick him up, but she did. He let go of his sister's hand. He was shorter than the truck, and I didn't see him. They were waiting for the light. The light turned green, and I went. It almost tore his ear off. A lot of blood filled his sister's lap where they sat on the curb. I asked how the boy was now, how he was. He did not know the answer to either. Said the policeman recommended he not call the hospital, not apologize, because that would be admitting guilt. But how can I not? I spent 8th grade at the cemetery, tossing French fries to crows, eating sandwiches from the hamburger stand next to the junior high. The school was right across the street from the graveyard. I didn't visit her, sat instead under a Douglas fir and talked to birds, coaxed them close with fried potatoes. By spring, one of the crows would take a French fry from my hand, hop backward before swallowing. Our house sits on a shoreline at the bottom of a steep bank, 100 steps to the front door. The stairs wind around trees, over small ravines of Devil's Club and Salmonberry. There are stretches of boardwalk between steps, pillared above the damp soil. We cart every grocery bag down, every trash bag up, week after week. We can take the stairs down in about 12 seconds. The trip up is 25 at a dead run. On my brother's 18th birthday, in his absence, there is no cake. I am outside on the wraparound deck. At 10, my father paid me $1 an hour to paint it, 2x4s covered with a redwood stain. I hear something, but I don't know what. I yell through the door that I am going to the road. I run up the steps, faster even than when my brother dares me to race him. The stairs end in a parking area filled flat above the slope to the water. Salmonberry grows higher than my head, and I have to round the corner of the bushes to see. A girl is lying on the pavement. She could be asleep, except for the pool widening under her hair. A man is standing in the road. The center line gleams beneath his boots. He looks from her to me. I look at the girl. She wears a green sweatshirt, like one I have. No, it is my shirt, the Snoopy sweatshirt that says, "Born to sleep in the sun," and the sun is shining on the blood, blinding me with its light. I'm going to read the last poem in this first section, and then I'll move on to a little bit different part of the book. The title of this is also the first line of the poem. There's a poem in here that I'm not reading tonight called Speaking of Injured Birds. And in there it talks about my family's habit, which we all still have today, of trying to rescue any little animal or bird. And the title of this is actually a fairly factual poem. This is Porcupine Child. Porcupine child, wounded at roadside, pricking my skin as we hurry toward the hope of more capable hands. The fog line a blur beneath tears and torn sneakers, the same line crossed when my sister fell to the pickup. Cars come up fast as the tides, the quilled baby hammocked in my shirt, muse and muse. How did I come to be the ferryman, burying over and over the same stick in the water, taking babies across the black river, rubbing their stains into my belly? I'm going to read a few new poems, but I'm just going to kind of intersperse them with poems from the book. And this poem, I think, has made it to the poetry poll. It's called When We Were Small. And one of the things that my sister's first accident and then her subsequent death did to me was it made me feel very powerless. I didn't feel like I had control over everything or over anything, and in fact, I don't. But it's hard to accept that when you're a child. And this poem, When We Were Small, is kind of resisting that notion that we're not in control of anything at all and trying to just be in control of just the littlest little thing. When we were small as cutthroat hearts, I'm going to back up and introduce one more thing. There's a dog in this poem named Lobo. He was one of our childhood dogs, a great big dog that was part yellow lab and part wolf. He had these amazing ice blue eyes, and he was huge and very comforting to be around when you were a child. When we were small. When we were small as cutthroat hearts removed in one deft flick, last beat, feeble in my brother's palm. Small as the cloud reflected in its wet pink sheen, the black pearl plink into tins we filled with crowberries, our faces upside down in each curve, damp heather spreading from the ground to corduroy knees. Small as a breath pressed into Lobo's fur, his ears the silk edge of a blanket. Small as the chickadee in a Quaker Oats box we lined with tissue, hollowed a thumbprint nest for, limp bit of fluff that mistook a cabin window for sky. A common enough mistake, that, and small consolation to revive one bird, to brush its down from the pain, clear the imperfect web discovered in a corner, reclaiming the sky in our small way. We had another dog named Champion. It was my father's notion of trying to turn him into a champion bird dog, which was unsuccessful. The dog was half chocolate Labrador and half Chesapeake Bay Retriever. He was another great, big, comforting dog. And he didn't want to be a bird dog, but he did want to be a fisherman. He loved to come fishing with us. And we got to where no matter what kind of fishing we were doing, Champ came with us. Whether we were fishing from the side of a bank into a creek or on the lake or on the boat. And he actually really loved to be on the boat with us. Excuse me. In this poem, which came about from an assignment and actually a challenge to write a sonnet using assigned end words, which you'll probably hear, poor Champ had to not only change his name but his sex to be in this poem, but it's really for him. This is Stephen's Passage sonnet. I remember waiting for the salmon run in June, the patient oiling, rewinding of our reels, stress kept on the filament for evenness, half-moon nickel key wedged in the fishfold ring. How we'd obsessed to reach Bird Rock before high tide, floating snake of pollen and debris a current rendered moot on days the coho followed herring to the black cake of glacier rock, that sheer face we called Old Butte for its power to lure the silvers in. How Garbo, our chocolate lab, shivered on point until we'd play a salmon out, then vault over the side like a hobo leaping from a freight car, her tail wagging all day for a single landed fish, its scaled rhinestone sloughed across the deck in slick, salt-washed cologne. So growing up in Alaska, there was a lot of hunting and fishing going on, as you can imagine. I think there's a fair amount going on over here. There were a lot of dangers as a child. One of the ones that my family was entirely unaware of was the dangers of lead poisoning. So that's the beginning of this poem, that we knew nothing about it. We helped my father make lead weights for duck hunting. This is Decoys. 2 days before hunting season, my father melts lead in an iron pot while we dig holes in the yard with teaspoons from the kitchen drawer. He stirs with a green branch until the kettle shakes. At any moment, a finger will disappear in it, come out bone or nothing at all. Steam rises into his nostrils with cigarette smoke until he becomes Merlin, waving a silver wand over holes and beer cans and children. My brother follows behind the ladle, inserts wire into scalded holes, balances looped ends until they burn him. When the yard is pocked with lead, we traipse inside, trailing dirt and bent spoons. Mother tries to look disapproving, but she forgives anything. The handles are still hot, the holes like rows of dollhouse teacups, but we pull anyway, toss the weights in water that hisses at each intrusion. We carry decoys from the shed, lay them at my father's feet. He spent all summer cradling the birds, touching them with his paintbrush. Underneath, rubber loops prevent the ducks from sitting upright anywhere but water. We twist more wire to anchor weight to bird, 1 for teal, 2 for mallard. We line them up, their painted eyes staring, the kettle glazed with lead, my father coughing, a Pall Mall hanging from his lip. Opening day, only he and my brother go, and it is 30 years before I learn what happened there. My father with too much brandy, and my brother tired and cold, the shotguns pointed at each other instead of the sky, ducks flying over unharmed, decoys motionless on the pond. My father died in 2001 from complications of heart disease. He'd had several heart attacks about 3 years before that, and was never in good health in that 3-year period. One of the things that is difficult about, in an accident, the death is sudden and unexpected, and in an illness, the death can be prolonged, and you know the end is coming, and it's still really difficult. But one of the most difficult things is that last time in the hospital when we knew that there was nothing that we could do that would change the outcome, and trying to make the decision as to whether to withdraw life support or withhold treatment was a difficult one. And this poem came from that, and another childhood memory. This is called Vigils. The field mouse lay on the garage floor like a dropped rag. We huddled close to see if the mouse was dead or only playing, bowed our heads in the dim light, our hair hanging in a circle above our shoes. The mouse gathered its legs beneath it, closed its eyes. The scent of oil and gasoline rose from my father's motorcycle, where it rested on upended milk crates, so that years later, gathered around his hospital bed behind pink and brown curtains, this is what I smell, this memory of mouse and oil, that long vigil until exhaustion and daylight overtook us, and we nodded at the suggestion. I'm going to read a couple newer poems. This poem came in answer to a question that Dan Peters asked of me. And the first time I answered the question, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I didn't feel that I adequately answered the question. And so I wrote about it, and this is what came. It's a little bit of a kind of an undisciplined poem. The title is also the first line. He asked me where I'm coming from when I write about loss. You know, I made something up, something not dangerous, bleaching around the ankle-deep water, looking for a place to latch, to preserve the child. He asked where I am coming from, but haven't I already, or won't I soon? Those notes I took, with red staring me in the gutter, flat-footed run for the water. I never made it past that point where the stick went through the skin beneath the jaw and out beside the gold crown, the money spent on cigarettes and beer, and the sometimes bottle of pinch, that old Scott, the swept-away tales of who never fell from the deck, or how the door never slammed its latch into the space between ridges on the back of his hand where the poison went uphill fast, looking for a heart to lodge in, swell and ripen in the fall to pavement. Not the story of loosened teeth, pointed double barrels, boots lost in blue clay, frostbite. But even he, after the rare, calm night of heavy snow, even he sucked in his breath and carefully at his sides rested his hands, stepped slowly without jarring the railing or its high curled waves of snow rolling in on us along the stretch of walk where light came through the trees, and where I'm coming from, the porcupine and my feet, even in mid-July, the hemlock bark ice sticky, and my ankles burn with quills. So I thank you, Dan, for that poem. So one of the things I described the stretch of walk, the 100 steps down to our beach house, and it wasn't just an even, ordinary set of steps. It was pretty haphazard, and the stairs wound all around. I don't know how I don't think they were designed. I think they were just nail up a step and nail up another one, and eventually they got down to the beach. But there were these stretches of boardwalk above little ravines. I talked about that in a previous poem. And every once in a while in the winter, we would get a very calm night and a very heavy snow at the same time. And in the morning, sometimes we'd wake up and the railings would be lined with waves of snow. And on the stretches of boardwalk that were most likely to get light, because there was a lot of trees there, the snow would build up and curl over like ocean waves. And sometimes if there was enough snow, it would actually form a curled wave. And we would, all of us would do everything we could. We'd walk up the stairs like this to try not to knock the snow off the railing, which made for a lot of falls. And that played in that poem. All right. During my father's last days in the hospital, my mother explained to us his wishes about burial. He didn't want to be cremated. He wanted a regular, old-fashioned burial because the thought of burning was really unappealing to him. And my mother went out during his last 5 days or so in the hospital and found 2 burial plots side by side in a local cemetery near where they lived. And then she told us that she didn't share his feelings about that she really wanted her ashes scattered. And we had a little discussion about that. And some of that plays into this poem. This is, after Dad's burial, Mother takes a hike. She'll take her leave on a windy day above a river of our choosing. What fates she once believed in tidied up and left her in our hands. She memorizes with 2 fingers the tiny hardness in her breast, speaks of him by salty transformation, as one whose bones have begun to lighten, as though a bird dark shadow lifts the years spent sleeping next to cliffs they edged together. Tired of being stitched to his side, she communes with sky and schemes to avoid that sleep. Exile me, she tells us, far from his monument. Only place a marker with my name. Take the rest of me to water. So we're planning on doing that. And she's healthy, by the way. In our class discussion, we talked about one of the ways of generating a poem was to steal a line from another poet or another writer, write it at the top of the page and just see what happens. This poem, which I don't really know if it's finished or not, came from my trying that out, and I thought I'd read it tonight. It's currently titled, Burning the Paper Birds. When you were singing, anger fell like cigarette ash to the carpet. Pollywogs sprang up to swim in the lower deltas of your lashes. The dog with corn silk ears bayed and rested his head upon our heads, our mouths as soft as chickadees. Frost rattled the window's single pane like a paper bird. Brother folded like origami in his fold-up bed, all his belly energy vested in trying to disappear. Morning, in the air above Mud Bay after the night you died, paper feathers blackened and curled into questions on the tide line of the flats. Questions dissolved unasked as rain dampened birds into the alders, lining the shore that smelled in spring of just caught kings. Salmon scales fly over the waves that cover the mud at high tide. The water swims into Dogfish Creek, and the creek pushes out the salt and silt of the people who loved you in the lifetime before you left us all unwinged. The flats began at Dogfish Creek, and the God who fished the creek of our childhood had a mouth softer than yours, O Father, when you were singing. I'm going to read a poem that on its surface seems only to be a poem of loss, but for me it also is a little bit of a celebration of the hope of wholeness after we leave this life. And we are bound away. Joel taught my sister to lead the grouse, to shoot in front of its path so that the bird flew into the buckshot, so that, he explained, it wasn't really her doing the killing. And she taught Joel how to pluck the grouse, to hold his breath when the crop was cut, the way we'd learned on ducks Dad brought down with his shotgun. When Joel joined Search and Rescue, he couldn't have known a 727 would slam into the mountain, that there would be no rescue, that he'd become a garbage man, maneuvering halves of bodies into plastic bags, passengers sheared by their safety belts, innards congealed in the opened cavities of their bodies. After that, he kept one hand at his belt when he traveled. In the air, on the ground, it didn't matter, he said. He'd rather be tossed through a windshield into a Sitka spruce, launched into sea or mountainside, than be cut in half to be buried or burned in pieces. When my sister left him to follow God, Joel followed me, sometimes called me by her name. He practiced yoga and massage, lifted my calves in his palms, kneaded the tension he found. He quit driving, took his life day by day, stepped in the path of a Greyhound bus, one hand gripping the buckle of his belt. So I think I've got 3 more I'd like to share with you. This poem is set during the era of the Vietnam War, but I think maybe it is just as useful today in thinking about war. I'm trying in this poem to show how during times of trouble, in times of great trouble, in fact, I think the more acute the trouble is, the more likely we are to turn toward normal things and try and find some joy and distraction in going about our lives as though there was nothing terrible going on. And this poem is dedicated to all the girls in my junior high class and all of their big brothers. It's called Every Leap Year Dancing. Shelley was always a year older, always tugging wayward kinks at parties. She was always the one who looked best in skin-tight jeans we pegged by hand. Shelley hated her hair almost as much as she hated her brother for going to Vietnam, for sitting in a helicopter, riveting rice paddies in coarse woven indigo, hated the way her hair turned to wool when it rained, and it always rained in Juneau in 1972. We drowned in music that punctured the air like coiled wire. We peeled our clothes to dance on grained tapestry, tacked to a pine floor in the loft of the last house on Rivers Street. Shelley haloed in lamplight, dimmed with a purple bedsheet. The Allman Brothers jamming Pony Boy through our pores, the notes uncurling, turning us until we collapsed, lying so close, my breath frayed through Shelley's hair. When the rest of us were getting perms, Shelley was straightening hers with an iron. To read one more newer poem, and then I'm going to end with the last poem in the book. I like to think of this poem also as a celebration of acceptance of the aging of the body, and in that way it is kind of a praise poem. It's called Falling Asleep Thirsty on My 50th Birthday, and it's set in the future. Falling asleep thirsty on my 50th birthday. Body, your skin is making room for another. Claim your bones if you will, but count each year as preparation for entry. Whole legions of saints seek peace in the accordioned flesh gathered at your throat. Your clavicle, a hoe blade sunk in dry clay, sun-bleached, strike against your marrow. Still your vertebrae curve with the tide, shift beneath soft new robes, wrinkle of breast and belly, ribs, a stair rail you hold to in lieu of warmth. They're stepping in under the hem. They're swarming over the once elastic door jambs of your pores. If you would thirst no more, let them in. I'm very grateful for your presence tonight. I really enjoyed myself, and I'm thankful that to be able to share these poems with you. This poem, as I said in the class discussion we had earlier, came from a writing exercise given to us in which we were to gather items that were red and make a shrine of them. And I had no idea what would come from that poem, but I feel that this poem, I put it at the end of the book because I think it kind of sums up the journey that I took through this book of moving from the grief of death to the wonder of growing up and praise at having survived. And I don't know that I've completed the journey, but I feel like I've come a long way. And this is Red Shrine. Drape a sari in the madrona. Let its hem trail dry grass. Pink silk and gold bead, seed pearls stitched into daisies, topaz thread and blossom. The sari touches earth as the tree cradles a slip of moon. Bark beneath a bolt of silk, what slips beneath skin. Red curls away, the tender new emerges and the sari touches what is dead. Yellow leaves, bits of twig and last year's fruit, above what is living. The madrona sari, its silk like skin, beads like the song we sang while washing our hair in the bread bowl with water we melted from snow in deep winter. Skin you shared with me, holding my hand even when you did not want to. You are in the tree now, and I am in the cradle. I have not taken money from your drawer, have not made fun of your thighs, nor left you behind. I have not failed to recognize you there on the pavement, the sun a bright circle of silk in your blood. Thank you.